Welcome to the SDA Housing Podcast, brought to you by NDIS Property Australia. Before starting this episode, we need to provide a general disclaimer. Information contained in this podcast is general in nature only. It does not take into account the objectives, financial situation, or needs of any particular person. You need to consider your financial situation and needs before making any decisions based on the information in this podcast. And you should consider seeking independent and professional advice for your personal circumstances. All right, let's begin.
Hello everybody, my name is Minh and I'm your host, and you're listening to the SDA Housing Podcast, a show that explains, highlights and guides and brings awareness about all things SDA in this ever-changing endless world. Today we have a repeat speaker, Brad Fuller. Brad, how are you?
I'm very good, Minh.
Mate, today's topic is 2024, what to look out for this year. How are you feeling for this year ahead of us, Brad?
Look, the Royal Commission report, as we touched on last time, has provided a little bit of uncertainty. So we want to look forward to some clarity on that report from the government. That would be the first thing that's important. Other than that, we still have a great number of participants in great need of providing some housing that's safe, stable, and fit for purpose. So our mission for that hasn't changed. So we're certainly looking forward to seeing houses built in areas where we truly know participants want to live. And as we look back through 2023, we have noticed that there is a lot of houses being built in areas where I think homes will struggle for participants.
Okay, so let's break this podcast today into little 4 or 5 different sections. The first one is be careful about the info you're receiving from people you're talking to. Can you elaborate on that, please, Brad?
Look, as an SDA provider, we are completely and utterly focused on the best outcome for a participant. And I've said it many times, like a broken record, the right location, the right design. We've had input in our designs from people with disability themselves. And so these houses that we recommend are functional. They are fit for purpose. Our data and our research points us to areas where we know participants need housing. And also our research isn't just from the NDIS data. We drill right down, talk to SILs on the ground. We get the data from them. We talk to them. We know how many participants the SIL providers, the supported independent living providers, in case you're not aware what that stands for, but also I just call them the carers. So it's important to get that research off the ground as well. But we also look at the data from each quarter, which is flawed. I mean, its basic flaw is that it's 3 months in arrears. So even if, people were funded today, we're not going to see that data until probably March. So you've got to be very careful about where you get your research from, because the NDIS story is a very powerful story and it is true. However, there are a lot of people that are promoting the properties in areas where I would say they just want to make a sale. And you must be wary of this. Do not just take the data from someone who's telling it to you. Make sure you drill down, find an SDA provider that is working with data and strongly working with data, who's in communication with people on the ground about what participants are doing, where they would like to live. The basic elements are still the same, in close to shopping centres, close to hospitals. And I'd like to make a note again, as I did last time, the hospitals need to be hospitals where disability services that participants need are within them. You just can't say any hospital. I mean, there are many hospitals through Australia, and in some states they're just called wellness centres or care centres, and they do not have the specialty services or equipment that some participants need. So you've just got to be cautious about the kind of information you're receiving. Look, be careful. Make sure your SDA provider just does SDA. You don't want biases involved. You don't want them being involved in selling property out there, because instantly you have a bias in that. Certainly.
So Brad, you're saying if someone is selling you an SDA property who also says, oh, don't worry, mate, we're also an SDA provider, that's a bad thing?
Well, it's a conflict of interest.
Please explain to our listeners why that's a bad thing, please. Potentially a bad thing, potentially.
Well, look, everybody is, at the end of the day, looking after their own assets and interests. And this is where the conflict lies. We need to be focused purely and simply on getting it right at the front end for participants. And if you've listened to any of the information or national speaking tours that I've been on, that is what we continually say. The secret to this investment is to make sure that the house you're building is more desirable than the other 20 or 30 that are going to be there in the years to come. And the only way to do that is do what we've done and take advice from participants about the functionality in their houses. So we know we've got that right. We have houses that have tenants, and in the same street, there are houses without that. The SDA provider needs to have a solid history in understanding participants. Why would a participant choose a provider? And look, I can say that many providers do not have long history in disability. Check that first. Check your provider to see that they have a long and extensive history in advocating for people with disability. It is a core element.
Brad, I've seen a lot of startup providers pop up everywhere in Sydney, Melbourne and Perth. And I think, our listeners who are also investors should really look into their background. Just because someone says, I have a provider license, does not mean they're a good provider. Just like Brad, just because someone has a real estate license doesn't mean they're a good real estate agent. Correct?
Correct. It's about how you conduct yourself and your core behaviour. Now, as an SDA provider, we have a responsibility, firstly to participants. That is our mandate from the NDIS to be the eyes and ears of them. But we also have a responsibility to people who are building the houses to help us provide housing. And look, that could be $800 to $1.6 million. So we also have to be respectful of that. But if investors do take our advice and only build and spend that money in areas where we know we can tenant those houses, then that's where the risk is diminished. And that's what we're seeking for participants. You cannot do this investment for pure love. We understand that, right? Even though we're very participant first, we understand we have a great balance in what we do. I know we have to be respectful to both parties, but the way we do that, Min, is making sure we're in the right location with the right design. And of course, make sure you've got the right SDA provider, because a participant chooses their SDA, an investor chooses their SDA provider. Now, if something goes wrong in that house over the next 20 years, the participant needs to know that they can pick up the phone and ring their SDA provider, and that is someone who is an advocate for them, someone who understands their needs and will react promptly. I mean, I see some SDA providers trying to manage houses from Sydney to Cairns to Brisbane, over in Perth, and they're, a plane ride away? I would say, and our model has always been, that we need people on the ground close to where our houses are. And so this is one important thing that investors should also ask of their provider. If something goes wrong in the house, how do you get there? If I choose an SDA provider, will a participant want that SDA provider? Will the wrong SDA provider impact participants coming to your house? And I can tell you, we have seen that. We have seen streets where we have houses and others are empty, because unfortunately, some SDA providers have been real estate agents with big rent rolls who have jumped into this space thinking it's a rent roll. And let me tell you, when participants talk to them and they do not speak the language of disability, they get unveiled very quickly. I've even heard of builders and developers jumping in and becoming SDA providers. And of course, what they're missing is that a participant chooses their provider, and it's a very serious choice. And what it can do for an investor is impact who and the quality and quantity of tenancy in that house, because participants want to choose an SDA that they know for the next 20 years they can call on if there's a problem.
Brad, I've seen in the marketplace 3 or 4 or 5 different real estate agents who are also SDA providers, or SDA providers that are also real estate agents. And I could definitely tell and see the conflict right there myself. But it's hard for consumers, mum and dad consumers, to see through that.
Well, look, having property experience in the management team and disability experience is a good thing. But let me tell you, when participants choose, they are choosing more on the disability side. I mean, it's handy to have property resumes because we do or can wear a real estate hat in terms of managing the property. And we actually do both. Like, I do both. We manage the property, but we also manage it under our mandate from the NDIS. to make sure the home and living experience of the participant is as good as it can be. And this way, it's kind of a one-stop shop. We do it because we want good eyes on the house. We don't want an untrained person who maybe doesn't have a resume and disability going to that house, opening it up for inspections or for inspections for participants, but also inspections for simple things like smoke alarms or a fire extinguisher alarm, fire extinguisher checks, hot water checks. These elements, we get to go in and we actually get an opportunity to look what's going on in that house. And that's why we do it, to have better eyes on the house so we can service our primary mandate, which is look after the well-being of the participant. So participants choose, very important. Get the right SDA. Investors also choose, and I know that investors have chosen what we do because we've got that balance of property and disability, but they also see that we are heavily connected to the participant world. We have a great reputation in advocacy, and that's the main reason investors, I think, are choosing to go with us as their SDA provider.
Gotcha. Well, that's a good finish to the topic of being careful about the information you receive. That's fine. Now let's move on to another topic here for 2024. That is being open-minded to apartments as a SDA product. Can you elaborate more, please?
Well,
How about the history of SDA apartments and how it's evolved to where we are now?
Apartments were a funded category from the NDIS. So if you went to the NDIS calculator and you chose to look up an apartment, 1 or 2 or 3 bedroom apartment, and chose HPS or fully accessible or the IL category, it would come up with a calculation. Now, originally, apartment funding was quite high. It said 1 bedroom, 1 resident funding, which was around 100,000. So again, I'm just speaking about the base price. It's a little bit more or less in other areas. But in the original calculations, there was also a category called 2 bedroom, 1 resident funding. Right? And that led to a lot of confusion because a lot of people thought if they built an apartment that had 2 bedrooms in it, they would automatically get the higher level funding, which was around $123,000. So again, a lot of people started promoting to investors, buy an apartment or build one that's got 2 bedrooms and you'll get this higher level of funding. And right there, that was a complete myth. The 2 bedroom funding was really for someone who needed the extra room for medical equipment. And it is the rarest of high physical support funding. The only one that I've ever seen has been someone who was on a dialysis machine and they needed that second room for that medical equipment. And they were funded by the government, the NDIA, for that higher level of funding. But the other funding was one bedroom, 1 resident funding. And the other confusion in that area was people thought that if you built a 1 bedroom apartment, then you would get that funding. Or if you built a 3 bedroom apartment, you could put 3 people in it and you'd get that funding, which was also a myth. The 1 bedroom funding, I could have a 5 bedroom penthouse and put 1 person in it and they would get what's called the 1 bedroom apartment funding at $100,000. If I put a second person in that apartment, that would dilute that funding and a third would dilute it again, just like it is in a house. But here's where the two worlds collide, where people look at this as simply a financial calculation, Min. It is not. You've got to come at it from participant first. So we always recommended 2 bedroom apartments. And in fact, we have been involved with a lot of apartments throughout Australia and giving advice about implementation and design. I've got a long history and resume in that area, as well as being, an SDA provider. So we've been able to show people what participants want. And I keep coming back to that. It's so important. So a 2 bedroom apartment with 1 resident will get that higher level of funding. However, it will be an apartment that will be chosen before any other apartment because the second bedroom is a great space where family and friends can come over and visit and stay. And this, through the eyes of the participant, is a very, very important element to make that apartment more desirable for them to choose it. I mean, if you had a 1 bedroom apartment and next door to it was a 2 bedroom apartment, which one would you choose? It's not rocket science. But unfortunately, a lot of people came at this. They didn't stop. And I've always encouraging people to look at it through the participant's eyes, to understand their needs, And then, hey, let's build something with them in mind and therefore increase your certainty of tenancy because you've built the right dwelling. But you need advice to do that. You just can't take advice from someone who's saying, oh, build a 2-bedroom apartment and you'll get the higher level of funding. There are so many more complexities about the way the funding works. But in terms of apartments and their viability, in our surveys, most people would love to live on their own if they could. However, they're simply not funded to do that.
Now, Brad, hold that thought. About 3 months ago, 2.5 months ago, you had a light bulb moment. It was you and me on the phone late one night, and I said to you, Brad, the problem is the market thinks, or people think, consumers think, and rightly so, they say the words, I heard it's too hard to get apartment funding for participants. Therefore, there's a very strong likelihood of my apartment being empty because of the challenges, complexities of getting funding approval by the NDIA for apartment funding, which is true. Until I said to you, Brad, you've been blinded by SDA housing. Housing. Everyone thinks housing is the be-all and end-all. There's more to SDA than just houses because everyone's building all these substandard houses in the further suburbs out of metro areas. And if you look at the NDIS SDA participant future projections of the top 10 areas, for example, around Australia for the next 19 years, Melbourne was 4 of the top 5. Inner Melbourne was in the top 3, and inner Sydney was also in the top 10 as well. This goes back to one topic here, which is housing funding can be brought to an apartment property, correct or not?
Yeah, with some discussions with the NDIA, this is true. So it really relies. Everyone thinks that if the government funded you to live in a house with 2 other people, that you couldn't go anywhere else. That's where you had to go. However, what people didn't realize is if an investor owned an apartment or owned a villa, they could accept a person who has house funding into their villa or apartment if they were prepared to take the funding level that participant had, which would have meant when a funding for an apartment is at $100,000. And look, there's a whole topic there where we always believed, why is it 100? A house was $50,000 for a high physical support funding, and an apartment was 100. We all know why there was more funding for an apartment. There are body corporates. There are higher maintenance costs for the apartment, but mostly around body corporate. But all of us thought, why 100,000 though? A house at 50, everyone would have been happy with 70 or 80, probably would have covered the costs. And I know that we have seen a lot of funding, I shouldn't say diluted, but there's a lot of people that we thought should have been funded to live in apartments, but they were funded to a villa, which is only around 65,000. So the government's kind of doing a money saver by doing that. And a lot of people don't realise that a participant goes to get a housing goal, they have to make application for their SDA funding. And a government assessor chooses and tells them what they will be funded for, which could be an apartment. And there are a lot of reviews going on. And our friend Brendan, who was one of those people who wanted to live in an apartment and had to go and fight the NDA for 3 years to get his funding because he believed his disability was such that he didn't want to live and shouldn't have to live with other people in a house. And he eventually won that fight, harrowing experience as it was. But what people also need to realise, if you had an apartment, and in Sydney, there are hundreds and hundreds that are empty, because originally they went by that silly design that said, I'll just build a 1-bedroom apartment, I'll put 10 on a floor, and people will come. But of course, the missing bit of that equation is participants come, they will choose that apartment if it fits their lifestyle and fits their purpose. If it's not well designed and it's tiny like a studio, they're not going to choose that. They do not have the restrictions that we do. They do not have to look into their bank account. They will choose it on design, location, functionality. So everyone has to be wary that they are doing everything they can to design a property that a participant will choose, find more desirable than the others. And look, to me, that's the future of SDA, making your house more desirable. Anyone who's been tricked into building the cheapest house on the cheapest block of land is going to struggle with tenancy for sure. But apartments, is interesting. Imagine being in Melbourne, in the back skirts of Werribee, where there's a 3-bedroom house that's been built there, and it's, 45 minutes from the city. An apartment comes up in Melbourne Central where you can drop down the lift and into a coffee shop and a lifestyle. There's gym equipment there, there is pools,
bus stops, train stations.
And imagine that apartment owner saying, you know what, I'll accept that house funding and you can come and live in my apartment. Now, there will be some SIL funding requirements that will also make that a little more complex, but depends on the SIL provider that's in the apartment building. But there is that possibility now for people to jump from a housing arena and into an apartment if the investor was willing to take that level of funding. And I'd like to elaborate on that a bit, because in the new recommendations, again, there's a hint that there could be funding that's not necessarily by category, that it could be not on diagnosis, as the report says, but on need. And part of that, there's a rumour floating around that it could be that a participant will get funded a certain amount of money and they will have true choice and control, that they can choose to use that funding to live in a building, and all they need is an investor's saying yes to them to allow that funding. So imagine if you were funded $70,000 now, or in a 2-bedroom house that's $90,000 SDA funding. Imagine a participant coming to you, Min, who owns an apartment that's empty in central Melbourne or Sydney, and they say, would you accept $90,000 for your apartment per year, or $70,000? Would you accept my funding for that? Now, if you said yes, there's a great possibility, with a little bit of negotiation with the NDIA in terms of the SIL funding that needs to go with that, there is a great opportunity there for true choice and control for participants. And that's one of the other reasons I worry about these houses that are way out of town, that are not near hospitals and big shopping centres and infrastructure. I worry that they will have diminished tenancy opportunity, especially if some of these new changes do come into play and investors start to say, hey, you know what? I didn't want to accept someone at $50,000, but guess what? I'm happy to have someone come and live in my apartment and have them use their house funding at $70,000 or $90,000.
Yep, exactly.
So I think there's absolute opportunity for apartments in that scope. And again, it'll be interesting to see how this plays out under the new recommendations about giving greater choice and control.
Well, Brad, in this changing environment of NDIS, we have to adapt, investors have to adapt to changing market conditions. We've seen the income levels change from $50K per tenant participant in a house to 75, 80 grand now, Brad, as you saw with the recent review. We've seen a lot of collapse of builders around Australia in the general construction market, which is causing some concern and uncertainty of viability of builders. Maybe, and also we're seeing the repercussions of the oversupply builds of houses in the inferior suburbs of metro areas. And we're also seeing the future demand areas by the NDIS of where participants will be wanting to live. So being aware of all this information and data can give investors a bit of glimpse as to where their future investment or investment in SDA could be. This topic here, point number 2, is all about being open-minded to apartments. Right, Brad? I'm not saying you have to buy apartments. And truth be told, it's 50-50, Brad. Housing apartments is 50-50 at the moment.
Well, look, it's about the funding and making an apartment desirable for participants, because I'm hoping that this does evolve into better choice and control, true choice and control, where participants would imagine a world where they could take their funding. Maybe they're funded for an apartment building at $100,000, but they want to live in a house with 3 other people. Is it possible that they could use the difference in that funding? And there was a rumour that might be possible in the future, not to spend on anything, but maybe it would go into a bank. Maybe they could spend it on better supports, maybe some equipment, but certainly on greater care. And that would give more participants greater choice in that SDA funding that they are being given. Because remember, without the participants, that funding would not be there. It's at the grace of the participants that funding comes to investors. So I've always said, if we stop talking about the financial viability of it, because this is a great investment for people who can help their own families into the future, but the way to do it is to make sure that a participant's world, our residents, have the best house in the best location, and that's how you get yourself tenancy certainty and completely diminished risk.
Yes.
And look, that's where the future lies, especially in suburbs. I mean, we could talk about where I think suburbs are the ones we see the greatest need in. And it's not in these areas anymore that are what I would call the greenfield estates.
Well, speaking of which, next point is number 3, areas. What areas do you think are most undersupplied for SDA around Australia?
Well, that's it. You know what? That's become a very easier question to answer. We have spent, years now on making sure we've got the data as good as we can get it. And as I said, it's always difficult when it only comes 3 months in arrears. Ideally, we'd love to get it weekly or at least monthly. But you know what? Right now, you don't even need the data because it's pretty obvious that right across Australia, where participants want to live is as close as you can possibly get to the infrastructure of the city and the beachside suburbs. Now, if you want tenancy certainty, come in close. The financial issue with that is the land cost is double or triple. So in Sydney, it's 800,000. But in Newcastle, it's probably 300 or 400, maybe 500,000. In the Hunter Valley, you've got great demand there. But Newcastle, very high. Central Coast, the Sunshine Coast in Queensland. Man, someone could build me 10 houses in the Sunshine Coast. There are participants waiting there for housing. And because of the land cost being 400,000 to 600,000, the new benchmark for good SDA investment is in those areas, and I can tell you it's a mill.
So this is now point number 4 now. Point number 4 is, what is it your benchmark for SDA price?
In terms of price, you mean?
Yes.
Look, I believe at the very least, if the land does not have a high 3 in front of it, you're in the wrong spot. That is my honest view.
So, no, let me rephrase the question. What should investors in 2024 moving forwards be aware of as the bench price as minimum and the minimum range and maximum range to be in this new benchmark category you're talking about in terms of pricing?
Okay.
Overall pricing.
Look, for this phrase that I use about tenancy certainty or greater tenancy certainty or diminished risk, there's one way to get it, and that is spend more money on the land and spend more money on the house to make it more desirable. But at the moment, we have a huge lack of houses in close to cities. And why? Because it's financially unviable for many investors to spend $1 million or 1.2, or in Sydney 1.6 or 7. But guess what? If you do spend that money, this becomes a place where participants will flock to. They want to be in close to all that infrastructure. And again, participants are not looking in their bank account. They are not restricted by financial resources. They are choosing it best location, best design, best layout, its functionality. So there's my tip for the future.
So you're saying 1.0 to 2.0 million is the price range you're saying?
Oh, look, in the areas like where I can tell you there's demand, very close to Perth.
What are those areas, examples, please?
Okay, Newcastle, around that area. In Sydney, a huge imbalance of supply and demand in Sydney. Why? The land is $800,000. So that makes the house at least 1.5. But in Sydney, they now have to build full class 3, which has added $150,000 to the build literally in the last 6 months. So there's a long building approval process in Sydney, but an investor would be well rewarded because we really do have a need in Sydney. Participants will be very grateful if we could get more people to build in Sydney. That's for sure.
So, Brad, we were looking at some stock in Sydney that you also approve of, which is the low set 1.6 million-ish HPS houses and the double story HPSs with a lift, about 1.8 million. You're pretty bullish on that product in these areas, right?
I had a lot of input into those designs. And when I say certainly the people on our board, people who live with their disability every minute of every day, have given input into that design. We had a very willing builder that was willing to create something special. And I can tell you, those houses are the Hilton of SDA. I've shown them to many people, many participants, many SIL providers, and the response has been overwhelming in that, please keep that house for us. When's that built? Let us know straight away. So we know in Sydney, there's 5 million in the area, 1.9, I think, in the Sydney closer district. Obviously, there is a greater percentage of people in need simply because of the population numbers. So if anybody out there can help us build a house in Sydney, you really are buying yourself some tenancy certainty and giving what is a participant need, solving that problem for us because it's massive in Sydney.
Yep. So blue chip areas, beachside, river views, water views, inner metro, they're the areas we're talking about in terms of inner ring or inner city areas for housing and whatnot. Now, which leads on to my last topic here, Brad, that is capital growth. Because this new benchmark of $1 to $2 million, high demand, high needs, near amenities, is where we're going to see more capital growth, as compared to, in contrast, to the inferior products in the 700 grand packages the last few years.
Look, let me pose this question to everybody listening. If you had an unlimited budget, where would you like to live? Now, if you build a house in an area where you would like to live, I'll guarantee you that is going to be a place a great number of participants would want to live. However, I've often used the analogy of the Goldilocks zone where, too hot, like build me a house on Sydney Harbour, I would probably have people queued up to move into that house. But it's unviable. The land cost makes the entire investment. You can't do that unless it was purely for love and you expected no return. But you don't want to be out near the Blue Mountains in the middle of nowhere either. That's too cold. But you want to come back somewhere in the middle, where it's just right, the Goldilocks zone, as I've been calling it. And that's where the new regime of investment should be. Because there is a point where it becomes unviable to come in close, where the return does not work anymore. And so we've just got to balance that out and get as close in as we can. But if you could find a place where you would love to live, on the Sunshine Coast in Queensland, we do have a great need. We still have a need in Cairns, close in, not in the greenfield estates. In Newcastle, obviously in Sydney, in Melbourne, as close as you can get in there, not out in the greenfield estates. But you can pretty much be guided by, if you're spending 1.1 to 1.2 million as a base, you're probably in a very desirable area. The investment, if you just did it on numbers, would still be 10% or more. If you come back with me 3 or 4 years ago or 5 years ago, and we were talking to an investor and we were talking 10%, everyone would be jumping all over us to get that return. It's simply that now it's being marketed as 26%, and I see these 18%. But of course, those returns are based on the cheapest block of land in the furthest away area with the cheapest house. And now the house will still be compliant, but it will not be the most desirable house. Therefore, I encourage everybody that, look, in fact, maybe if you're not in that 1 to 1.2 bracket, maybe that is not the investment for you, because we do have only a finite number of participants that would require housing. So let's be very careful about where we provide the housing.
Very good, Brad. Well, I think it wraps up our podcast today. I mean, having covered those 5 topics, being careful who you talk to, be open-minded to apartments, be aware of the undersupply areas around Australia, be conscious of the new benchmark pricing of $1 to $2 million for blue chip products for SDA. And number 5, you can also achieve capital growth in those blue chip areas as well if you're playing it right. That's the message we're trying to give to you guys, our listeners, today of 2024. Looking ahead, we are in a changing environment of SDA here, and it's important that you as investors become more astute, if the word is correct, in how you should take action and who you should listen to in terms of SDA advice, because not everyone is out there to do what's best for you. They're doing what's best for them, right? And you're always going to do your homework and listen to other people and do a bit of research. The fact that you listen to this podcast episode in itself is a good thing. Myself and Brad are always here available to help give more one-on-one discussions if necessary. We'll be doing more podcasts this year with you, Brad, and also a few more webinars across Australia as we launch more product in Sydney and Melbourne with yourself as well as an SDA provider. But you know what? It's all about choice and control, even for the investors, Brad. Wouldn't you agree, Brad?
Well, the investors do have choice. And I'd just like to take one last point when you said about capital growth. A lot of people have said in this investment that you cannot get capital growth. It's all about the income. But you know what? If you build in these areas that we're suggesting that are close in, where participants really have a desire to live, those areas, by nature, no matter what property you build on those areas, they are going to incur a much better capital growth there than something out in the greenfield estates where there's hundreds and hundreds of similar houses. You only have to look at Sydney and Melbourne, in Perth, in Brisbane. The greater percentage of capital growth has occurred from the properties that are in areas that are closer into all the infrastructure. So that's something to consider for people who've heard that rumour that, you can't have capital growth with it. I believe you can, and you're doing a much greater service to the participants if you build in those areas.
Brad, thank you for your pearls of wisdom. I look forward to doing more episodes with you for the next few months, and good luck on your year ahead as a SDA provider. And we will redirect any queries that people will send to us, to you. I know you're very busy with your phone going hot over the last few weeks since the changes were announced, proposed changes, sorry. So we won't send in a flood of inquiries your way just yet until you're ready. But thank you so much for your time, Brad, and we look forward to talking to you more soon coming up. Yeah.
No, we're hoping we can give more clarity to everybody on the incoming weeks into the new year. We're really waiting for some government response to give us that.
Done. Thanks, Brad. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Ben.
We hope you enjoyed this episode. Please make sure you are subscribed and following us so you can keep in the loop with all of our upcoming episodes. We would really appreciate it if you could leave us a 5-star rating, a written review, and to share this podcast with those that could benefit. Until next time, catch you on the next episode.